Hi, Sarah.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Okay, let me just introduce ourselves. My name is Daniel Teehan. I'm actually a student working here at Blogging Heads, doing a sort of guest dialogue as part of my journalism class. And I'm lucky to be here today with Sarah Shourd. Sarah, you were one of three Americans held in Iran in 2009 for over a year, I think. And since then, you've been involved in some activism against solitary confinement in the United States, and you've written a book, and I believe we're working on a play. So we'll be touching on all of that. But I guess first, I think some people are familiar with the story of the three hikers in Iran, but I'm not sure everyone knows about the circumstances. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about what you were doing in northern Iraq and how that all came to happen.
Of course, yes. Well, I was living in the Middle East. I'd been living there for over a year with my now husband, Shane Bauer. We were living in Damascus, and at that time, Damascus was an incredible place to be, just vibrant and diverse. We had a very active social life, going to cultural events and parties and wonderful community of friends from around the Middle East and around the world. We, Shane and I were both practicing journalism, and I was teaching Iraqi refugees that were living in Syria and helping them get into actually schools in the US and Europe to pursue higher education. I had one of the best years of my life living in Damascus, and I was on break. I was also teaching English at the American Language Center, and I had a week off work. I had a vacation, and we decided to go to northern Iraq. Josh was visiting us, and I had known other people who'd been to northern Iraq, and they told me about how beautiful it is, the green mountains, the waterfalls, which is a rare thing. It's not something you could find in Syria.
And a relatively safe place for Americans at the time.
Yeah, exactly. In northern Iraq, actually no American had been killed or kidnapped there for decades, not even American soldiers during the war. Northern Iraq is a place that the U.S. has actually left a relatively positive footprint by making it a no-fly zone to protect the Kurds from Saddam Hussein in 1991. So it's a very distinct, it's almost its own country within a country. And it's a place where a lot of people go to vacation.
And so that's what you and Josh and Shane were doing at the time.
Yeah, we'd been there for about a week. We'd visited castles, and we were learning about Kurdish history. And we kept seeing posters of this beautiful green place called Ahmed Awa. And several people recommended it to us, so we took a cab there. And when we got there, there were hundreds of families, literally hundreds of people camped around this waterfall, singing and cooking, grilling kebab and around campfires. And so we decided to stay the night. And the next morning when we woke up, we asked the tea vendor about a good trail to walk on. And I think if we made any mistake, if there was any bad judgment on our part, it was that we hiked for too long. Probably it was a cultural difference. The tea vendor expected that we'd walk for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and we hiked for several hours. And it was just such a beautiful day, and we kept getting closer and closer to the ridge, and there was this feeling of just a little farther and we'll be able to get this incredible view. And when we got to the ridge, there was a soldier, and the soldier called us to him. He motioned for us to approach him. And now I later found out that that ridge is the unmarked border between Iraqi Kurdistan and Iran. So when we got to the guard, he pointed to the ground and he said Iran, and we realized that he had actually motioned or, gestured for us to cross that unmarked border.
So it had been an Iranian soldier who beckoned you across.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And so at that point, you had no idea that, you were about to, I think it was 410 days that you were in prison there. And it just all came out of this kind of idyllic hike that you were taking. How quickly did you realize that things were really messed up?
Well, you have sort of many narratives happening, competing narratives in your brain. A part of you was completely horrified, and I thought, I may never leave this country. This could be the end for me. But the narrative that won out was more rational and grounded and optimistic. I just thought this couldn't possibly last for more than a few days. I didn't even think it could last for more than a few hours. I knew that we had absolutely nothing incriminating on us. We didn't speak Farsi. The way that I was dressed, because I'd been hiking in northern Iraq where women really can dress however they please, I was wearing short pants and I was wearing a tank top and didn't even have a head covering. So I would have been arrested immediately in Iran just because of how I was dressed. So it just didn't seem possible that these soldiers could have any real suspicion that we'd been attempting to enter their country.
Right. So then if it wasn't a real suspicion of espionage or whatever it was that you were charged with, why was it that the Iranian government felt the need to hold you and Shane and Josh for so long?
Well, that's the big question. I think it was a very bad time in Iran. The fact that the Green movement had just been raging in the streets, and hundreds of thousands of political oppositionists had been arrested after protesting for democracy, and the second election of President Ahmadinejad, which they said was stolen. It was a tense time in the country, and there was definitely a need to blame the internal unrest on foreign agitators. And we fit into that narrative, although no one actually ever said that in the government. But I think it was implied. These 3 Americans came into our country, they're a security risk. And the other reason, I think, was just decades of animosity between our governments. And this nuclear deal that had been in the works and was still being stymied at every turn, we became definitely tied up in those larger issues.
Right. And then, so once you were in prison there, you wrote about your experience along with Josh and Shane in a book, Sliver,
Mm-hmm.
which is really quite a moving book.
Thank you.
You wrote about the conditions of solitary confinement in which you were held and some of the effects of that. So can you talk a little bit about the conditions of your confinement while you were there and what that was like?
Of course. Yeah. Well, I was in solitary confinement the entire time. And the closest that I've come to be able to describe it is to call it a slow death. It's a social death. You have no contact with any other human beings, in particular your family and loved ones, the people that you need contact with the most when you're in a state of complete crisis and total terror. A kind of suspended terror is the way that it felt to me, not knowing if the doors of my cell would burst open and I would be beaten or killed, or not knowing if I would ever get out of this situation alive and see my loved ones again. Your whole body is in pain. It's mental pain and it's physical pain, the pain of losing everything that you love, everything that's meaningful to you, everything that keeps you going and gives you a sense of identity and a sense of self in the world is gone. And what you're left with is an almost animal-like existence. I spent the early months of my imprisonment just pacing my cell, just relentlessly. It was a small cell. It was empty and barren, and I would just pace for 5, 6, 7 hours a day. And I eventually learned that if I exercised, did jumping jacks and push-ups and kicks, and if I just exercised until I exhausted myself, I could actually get some sleep because I had a terrible insomnia. And those early days of a kind of animal-like existence, crouching by the food slot in my door, listening for sounds from the outside just to orient myself, a cough or a footstep, would remind me that I was still in the land of the living. That turned into what I later described as a kind of plant-like existence, where you are, the guards take you out and put you in the sun for an hour, they water you, they make sure you stay alive. But there's no one to account for your mental health, no real acknowledgement that you are a living, breathing human being with a soul.
Yeah, it really sounds horrifying from how you described it here and in the book. So it was 23 hours a day, every day for 410 days. It's really kind of hard to imagine, just in terms of how you would pass those hours. I mean, you said you would pace and work out, but there's so many hours in a day. Did you fall into a routine, or was it really different every day?
I fell into a routine. Well, I wouldn't say fell into. I very consciously and diligently created a disciplined routine for myself. Eventually I got books, a few books, but there would be days where the greatest frustration was trying to read the same page over and over again and just not understanding anything because I couldn't concentrate. There are scientific studies that say in solitary confinement, the brain waves shift towards stupor or delirium in just a matter of 2 or 3 days. So 5, 6, 7 months into this, I had a disciplined regime of exercise, prayer, sort of what I called communing with the outside world, a kind of meditation where I reminded myself what was important to me and gave myself sort of a reason, tried to motivate myself to keep fighting, keep going, and stay hopeful. And I had a lot of reason to be hopeful. I knew that the world was not going to forget me. I knew that our story was huge and it was an international story, and that eventually the Iranian government was going to get tired of this. And I didn't have a lot of hope that my government would be willing to do what was necessary to free me, because I knew that I wasn't a very valuable prisoner. I knew that our government had a very strict no concession policy towards prisoner swaps and ransom and things of this nature. So that was demoralizing. But at the same time, I thought, we're like currency in the Iranian government is holding us. We're valuable, but that value is going to eventually decrease, and they're going to want to cash us in at some point.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up that issue of, the government, looking out or not looking out for you. It's obviously become a matter under scrutiny recently, unfortunately, with everything that's been going on with ISIS, and even last week with the failed rescue of a hostage held by Al-Qaeda. And it seems like in some of these cases, the government policy isn't entirely consistent. And I know you've written about this before. So I'm curious as to how your experience and your release kind of informs the way you look at these issues today.
Well, I mean, of course, it's difficult for anyone who's lived it. It's very difficult to be dispassionate about it. But I, of course, that's what's required to make these policy decisions. And I understand that. I mean, I was released after 14 months, and I was right in the center of the campaign for Shane and Josh. And I told in these meetings with the National Security Council, the White House, the State Department, again and again, I said, Shane and Josh and I, none of us would want anything to be done for us that would hurt others. We could never live with ourselves. We don't want to be freed regardless of the cost. That's not who we are as people. And I feel the same way now. But I think when you look at this issue, you have to see every situation is different. For example, the situation we're looking at now, ISIS, the Islamic State, is not a fair it's not fair to compare them to Al-Qaeda. They're a completely different organization. For one, ISIS has their own revenue. They make, by some estimates, $2 to $5 million a day from their so-called government activities and their own business activities. They're not hard up for cash the way Al-Qaeda is. I actually think that in the case of ISIS, the propaganda generated by these horrific beheadings and the videos that have been, completely dominated the globe, that fear and the propaganda, every country has extremists. The vast, vast majority of Muslims around the world loathe ISIS and say there's nothing Islamic about them. But there are people, young people, people that have been radicalized by their circumstances that are susceptible to this kind of propaganda. And I think that has been far more valuable to the Islamic State than any ransom would have been. That it never should have gotten to this point, and that paying a ransom actually would have done far less damage in the overall equation than this escalation towards war. Here we are in another war that seems like endless and inevitable. And I think that paying a ransom and freeing these American hostages early on would have de-escalated things and would have been an intelligent move on behalf of our government. And the other part of the argument that I think is really important to make is that the United States is not being totally honest when it says that it doesn't pay ransom, that it has a no concession policy. In my case, the Omani government paid our ransom, $500,000 for each of us. And I worked very closely with the Omani government for over a year after I was released. And I know that they did nothing without approval from the United States. that they were doing the United States a favor. We were tied up in the nuclear deal and, larger political issues. And that when governments do each other a favor, they expect at some point a favor in return. That's how politics work. The Omani government paid our ransom as a proxy for the United States. And what's the difference if the money is getting into the hands of a rogue government or a terrorist organization where it comes from? The money is still getting into their hands. And of course, we don't want that. That's not an ideal situation. But I'm saying there are instances in where that's the lesser evil.
Right. So you would say in general, it's more of a case-by-case thing than something where we could unilaterally say in all cases we will not pay. I mean, not that it seems that we do that anyway. But
no, of course, you can't. And the government doesn't do that anyway. There are plenty of other cases where the government has paid to get out FBI, CIA operatives, military. I think that our government should be scrutinized and criticized for having the backs of its own operatives and military workers, and disregarding the lives of journalists and aid workers. I think we need to safeguard the practice of journalism, that we couldn't even be having this conversation right now if it wasn't for so many brave journalists that have risked their lives out in the field, and humanitarian workers as well. As far as changing the face of America in the Middle East, that's what these humanitarian workers are doing. People in the Middle East will look at this and say, Americans don't hate us. They don't just make war on us. They actually care about us as human beings and try to help clean up some of the mess of their foreign policy.
Yeah.
So these people's lives should be valued just as much as FBI, CIA, military. And I want the American people to really stand up for their fellow Americans that are putting themselves in the line of fire.
Yeah. Although, I agree with that sentiment entirely, but, you do hear these voices that say every once in a while, these journalists are making the choice to go to these really dangerous places, whereas the soldiers are, doing it as their duty, and make a sort of distinction on that, humanitarian or journalists who are choosing to go into these dangerous areas and are assuming the risk. Is that something that people have even said to you, or if so, how do you respond to that? Yeah.
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't see a distinction. If you believe that joining the military is a way to help and do your duty, journalists and humanitarian workers feel exactly the same. And that's why I moved to the Middle East, and that's why my husband moved to the Middle East. And second of all, I think that, I'm sorry, what was the rest of the question?
Well, I was just wondering, whether you'd come across this sort of criticism that is sometimes lobbed that, if people get themselves into this situation, they can't expect the government, especially when the situation is so tricky for the government to.
Of course. Yeah, of course. I've heard that argument. The other side of that argument, specifically with these ISIS hostages, this 26-year-old woman that's still being held, and she and the other Americans that went into Syria during that time to do journalism, and she was bringing aid in from Turkey for refugees at the time of her capture. ISIS hadn't been beheading people at that time, so that's not even fair to say that they knew that was a risk. That came completely out of left field, and the American government, no one around the world predicted that the Islamic State would have gotten to this level of violence.
Right. No, it really is horrifying, and certainly not an easy issue from any angle for the government or for the families, and certainly not for the hostages. So I guess switching tacks a little bit, since you've been back in the States, you've done a lot of, journalism among other things. I think you write for the Daily Beast at various points and Solitary Watch. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, it is.
So I know at least for Solitary Watch, you've talked a lot about this issue of solitary confinement being used in the United States. And it's interesting on one hand, because I think most people would expect after such a traumatic experience, directly related to solitary, the natural thing would be to get as far away from it as possible, to not bring yourself back. And yet you seem to have done the opposite. And, I know you've taken some visits to people in solitary in the U.S. and just written a lot about it and seemingly devoted a lot of your time to it. So I guess the first question is just what made you take that angle instead of just putting it behind you?
Well, I think initially it was that I had a need to talk to other people that had been through what I went through. I didn't understand, and I still don't fully understand because it's not understood, what actually happens to your brain in that kind of extended isolation. I wanted to talk to other people to feel more normal, to feel like I wasn't just completely insane and and other people had been through what I was going through in the aftermath. I mean, when I was in solitary, I felt that every day I dreamed of getting out, that it would be just completely over, that I would have this beautiful reunion and I would feel connected to other human beings in a way that I hadn't for so long and feared and didn't know. I had forgotten really what it felt like. It was just a dream, a fantasy. And when I did get out, it was really disturbing how different I was, how changed, how hard it was to look into someone else's eyes. Just looking into my mother's eyes, it was painful. I had to look away. My eyes would start to hurt. And I didn't like to be touched. I didn't like to be in crowds. My whole body, my whole being had an almost irresistible urge to just crawl back into a hole and be alone and block everything out because it was so overwhelming and painful. And that led to later depression, rage, all kinds of uncontrollable emotions once I thawed out because I was just so frozen inside. And in that process, I met other people that had lived in solitary confinement in the U.S., and I started to scratch the surface, and I was just really shocked, just at the scale of how we use this practice. I mean, 80,000 people on any given day is a really conservative estimate. And this doesn't just happen in Iran. This is not, and my story in many ways is exceptional. It's unusual. It has never really happened before in the way that it happened. But our conditions are the norm in this country. The conditions that were held in are anything but unusual.
Yeah, and you talk about those 80,000 people. I mean, I think people starting to get this conception that we have this entirely loaded prison system with 2.3 million people incarcerated. These 80,000, are they put in there for, what have you found in terms of, I think a lot of people would expect that these are the worst of the worst, the violent offenders, the people that can't be controlled even within prison. But that's not always the case, is it?
No, that's what's even more shocking is when you start to look into it. Solitary confinement is used as a control mechanism in a prison system that's gotten completely out of control. I mean, mass incarceration is not possible. The number of people, it's the population of Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Philadelphia. If you just take all of those people and put them behind bars, that's what we're trying to do in this country right now. And unsurprisingly, we're doing it very, very badly. Mass incarceration is inherently cruel and unusual because we don't have the infrastructure to warehouse that number of human beings, nor should we by any extremes of the imagination. Is that a good idea? So it's used as a control mechanism. The threat of the whole is how guards and prison administrators keep prisoners in line. It's always there. If you don't look at me the way I want you to look at me, talk to me as a guard, if my authority feels challenged in any way, if you're walking too slowly down the hallway, if you have some contraband in your cell, I can single you out and put you in the hole as an example to keep everyone else in line. And the problem with that is that people go into the hole and they quickly decompensate. They get worse and worse. They end up acting out, breaking more rules. These violations add up and they end up in the hole for years. And sometimes they can never come out because they just go insane. Yeah.
And I think earlier this year we heard something about Albert Woodfox, who was a member of the Angola Three, and I think he spent something like 40 years in solitary confinement. And it's really horrifying when you start hearing a little bit about how long some people spend in solitary. And it's not part of people's sentences. This is not something that the judge hands down to them when they're sentenced, right? It's purely an internal control matter, as you said.
Which makes it completely unconstitutional. There's no judge, no jury. It's an internal affair with no oversight. That means that it's done completely arbitrarily. And go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, so how have you found that prison officials justify the use? What is the idea behind it? What is their justification?
Well, I mean, they say that it's for their protection. They say that it's violent inmates. And I'm not saying there aren't violent inmates in solitary confinement. Of course, prison is a very violent place. Prisoners kill each other, rape each other. All of this is real. They kill guards. That does happen, although it doesn't happen very often. It does happen. These are the minority of people in solitary confinement, but they do exist. But when we just talk about violence, let's take a minute to go back to what solitary confinement does to the brain. It directly affects the frontal lobe, which is the part of your brain right here behind the forehead. And this is the part of our brains that we use for impulse control. So you're taking someone who doesn't have impulse control, never learned it in the first place, resorts to violence when they're angry, sometimes over very petty things. You put them in prison, and the pressure is increased 1,000-fold. Of course, people are going to act violently. Then you put them in solitary confinement, and their impulse control is further damaged. They come out, and they're more violent. So it doesn't work with violent inmates. It doesn't work with mentally ill inmates. It doesn't work to protect inmates, which is another reason that it's used ostensibly for inmates that report rape, transgender inmates, juveniles and children, in some cases below the age of 18, are put in solitary confinement ostensibly for their own protection. And this is ridiculous because there's no protection from your own mind. People's minds can turn on them, and as I explained from my own experience, your mind can be your worst enemy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it is so varied in a certain sense in how it's used, because there's protective custody and then there's disciplinary in response to kind of the violent outbreaks that people kind of think about. Do you make any distinction between your advocacy against solitary, between, advocating just for people who are put there for protection, or do you think that it should still be used against the so-called worst of the worst, people who do kill other people in prison or other guards, or do you just think it should be unilaterally done away with?
Well, in order to eliminate solitary confinement, we're going to need to overhaul our whole prison system, which it's high time that happened. And in order to not have this ability to use torture, basically the threat of torture is what is at the disposal of guards and prison administrators. Anyone who's difficult to deal with, they don't have the resources to deal with because prison guards are undertrained, underfunded. They disappear them into the hole, and they may never come out, or they may come out directly into the streets where they're another threat. So one way to put it is that it's basically putting whatever problems society creates, they get put into the prison. And then the prison doesn't have the ability or the desire or the intention of really solving those problems. It's just postponing them and sort of putting them on hold, making them worse, and then putting them back on society. So what we've seen is after 30 years of mass incarceration, where the prison population has exploded and the population in solitary has risen even more precipitously in the last 30 years since the war on drugs and just this huge scale of incarceration. This project has clearly been a failure. Solitary confinement is the deep end of that system, but it's also a microcosm for the whole system, which doesn't rehabilitate, cuts people off from their families, cuts people off from any resources to change, and basically just throws them away. It's clear that's not working.
Yeah, and I mean the link between solitary, the use of solitary and mass incarceration that you talked about in the last 30 years, and I guess that number comes from the war on drugs that started. It wasn't really used before then, was it? At least for most.
Yeah. Well, there was an experiment in 1890. There was a penitentiary built in Philadelphia. You can still go there today. It's now a museum. And the Quakers were involved. A lot of money was poured into this, and the idea was, let's isolate people and give them a chance to reflect on their crimes, to pray, commune with God, and reform. And so it actually had a very, positive intention. People came out of that isolation crazy. They mutilated themselves, and they committed suicide. And they were obviously not reformed. And there was a huge outcry because it was a failed experiment. Charles Dickens came and visited the penitentiary, and he spoke out to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was inhumane and shouldn't be used. And Dickens wrote a beautiful quote, really kind of about the immeasurable effects on the brain, something that we don't even understand, being in some ways worse than torture of the body, because it's something that we have no idea how to address. And so in 1890, the Supreme Court made that ruling, and for the next 100 years, it was largely unused. It really wasn't until the 70s that it became necessary as a control mechanism, because prisons were getting so out of control, overpopulated.
Yeah. So you said that your interaction with this, started with you reaching out to other people who had been in solitary. Is that mainly through actually visiting them, or correspondences, or a combination of the both?
Well, yeah, I started a lot of letter correspondences. My work really focuses on how people preserve their humanity in inhumane conditions. So the creativity, the resistance, that's what keeps me going, and that's what gives me hope that people inside are never going to stop fighting for their own humanity, for their own right, for a second chance, rehabilitation. I've started out with over a dozen letter correspondences, and I visited many prisons and people in solitary around the country. And I work with Solitary Watch, and my colleagues and I have woven a lot of these stories and this beautiful writing. A lot of times people in solitary confinement, the only way they have to express themselves, their feelings, and to reach out and have connection with another human being is through writing. So some of their writing is just phenomenal, and we're publishing an anthology with New Press in the spring.
Really?
And I've also woven a lot of these stories and writing and the experiences I've had interviewing and meeting these people into a play called Opening the Box, which I've finished writing, and I'm now searching for a producer and hoping that we'll see it on stage soon, hopefully in 2015.
Wow, that sounds really powerful.
Thanks.
It sounds like, I don't know, a good way of kind of bringing the voices of people who are kind of shunned and put into this hole, as you put it, into the daylight. Because I think maybe one of the reasons that solitary is so effective and it goes on so much is that people don't really seem to be hearing about it so much. Mm-hmm. So was that part of the rationale behind writing a play?
Definitely. Letting people speak for themselves, humanizing. It's very hard for a lot of Americans to relate to a prisoner's experience. They think, well, I've always, obeyed the law. I'm never going to end up in prison. That couldn't happen to me. Of course, for people of color in our country and working class people, prison and the threat of prison is an everyday reality. Something that for Black men is most likely to happen in their lives. But for a lot of affluent or white Americans, that's just not something they can relate to. And I think before you can get people to invest in prisoners, they have to know their stories. And we have to change the stereotypes and these stories around prisoners that just aren't accurate. The image that people have of a person in solitary confinement is so far from the image of what I saw when I went into these prisons and met these people and got to know who they are.
Interesting. So well, hopefully the play will be one way of doing that. Yeah, it's been something I've been thinking about, especially this week. We saw the Senate's, torture report on the CIA, and obviously mm-hmm. full of horrifying things, and really got picked up by the Times and all the major outlets into a huge story. But 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a similar report released by the UN Committee Against Torture about the U.S.'s compliance, or I guess non-compliance, with the UN Convention Against Torture. And one of the things they talked about was solitary, and that mm-hmm. report really didn't seem to make as much of an impact here. So why do you think that this one form of torture that's being used in the war on terror is drawn so much attention, and this other form of torture that seems just as malicious and even more widespread really isn't making it into people's consciousness or into the media?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it's because solitary confinement doesn't leave any marks. I think that you can beat someone physically and people shudder because they see the scars and they can imagine being beaten. it's a leap of imagination for many people that they don't have enough stories, they haven't heard enough interviews like this where they can actually put themselves anywhere near in the shoes of someone that's been in a small box for years or decades, or months for that matter. I mean, months feel like years when you're completely detached and shut off from the world and have experienced this kind of, death of self, where you don't even really know for sure who you are anymore because you have no one to reflect with. I think that people, it's partially a problem of education, and I think that it's also the reason that torture has shifted towards, it's a cleaner, is one horrifying way of putting it, form of torture. That the only blood that's involved is if there's self-mutilation, and then the prisoner himself or herself is blamed. Of course, suicide is, by some estimates, 50% higher in solitary confinement than in the general prison population. But again, the prisoner itself and the prisoner's mental state is blamed for this, not the system, not the institution.
Yeah, and that's horrifying. I've seen that number before. And, it's interesting. I actually had the chance to talk to the commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Corrections the other day. He came to Princeton for an event we had. And some of the members of SPEAR, the prison advocacy group we have here, kind of questioned him about solitary. And, he kind of like brushed it aside and he was like, oh, no, there are no mentally ill people in solitary. But that just
Wow.
seems to be patently untrue. But, you get these officials saying things like this. And, the New Jersey before has denied even using solitary. And the U.S., in reporting to the UN, I believe, said that there is no systemic use of solitary. So Why is it that people are able to get away with this when it seems like such a clear, you're writing letters to these people. You know that they're solitary. Is it just that there's not enough people that care to call these officials, to call the government out on these abuses?
Well, how did we get to a point where we're incarcerating the number of people that we are today? People have been largely silent, and we've pushed crime and society's problems out of sight, out of mind. If we just lock these people up, we're all going to be safer. And that's proven completely ineffective. And the light is being shined, and there is scrutiny now, which is extremely hopeful. And we're moving in the right direction. But of course, and many states have changed their legislation on solitary confinement. There's been legislation passed to limit and ban the use of solitary with juveniles, with mentally ill.
Yeah.
Estimates are that 40% of people in solitary confinement go in with mental illness. And of course, many more come out because there's a lot of mentally ill people in our prisons and there's no way to deal with them. So they get, locked away and where they get much worse. Yeah.
No, there's been some news in New York. I think New York has banned it for juveniles, and there's a bill in New Jersey now. I think that was just proposed. So do you think it's this kind of piecemeal legislative state by state effort? To a certain extent, that seems hopeful in that there is progress being made. On the other hand,
it's a start.
Yeah.
It definitely sets a precedent. But it's also worrisome because it's not just specialty groups that are being subjected to this torture. It's people that don't have mental illness. It's men, it's women, it's every population. And so these pieces of legislation are hopeful, but I'm afraid that it's going to also, prison officials are just going to sit back and say, okay, our job is done. And we have to hold them to task for the fact that the number of people that have been let out of solitary confinement is really just scratching the surface.
Yeah. And you talk about that number of people that's being let out. I think there have been studies done that show that recidivism rates are actually higher. People reoffending when they get out of solitary because of, everything that we've been talking about in terms, yeah.
Right.
But it's interesting. You'd think that with all this research, with, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture saying that it's torture, with no other really civilized country in the world using it, that some of that pressure would be brought to bear. Right. Do you think it's just not enough at this point?
No, I think it is being brought to bear. Don't lose hope. Really, we've just begun this battle. This is a momentous task. And finally, after 3 decades, mass incarceration, people are waking up to the fact this is a failure. Just putting these people, locking them up, has not made our society any safer. It has not reduced crime. And, excuse me, the sun is getting kind of intense right here. That's better. So mass incarceration has been a failure. That's clear. Crime has only decreased it incrementally. And if you compare that to the amount of resources we've thrown into mass incarceration, it's obviously not worth it. It's a failed experiment. People are waking up to that solitary confinement is not only completely inhumane, that it's torture. The UN says it's torture, but it's also incredibly costly. It costs 2 to 3 times to house someone in solitary confinement to what it costs to house a prisoner in the general population. And thirdly, this is not in our interest. This is not in the interest of public safety. If people are coming out more dangerous, more mentally ill, just being dumped on society where we don't have the infrastructure to deal with it. And then so many of them end up back in prison, gobbling up our tax dollars in the same way. This doesn't make any sense to anyone. And people are starting to wake up to it, but it's going to take, power concedes nothing without demand. This is a deeply entrenched system, and it's going to take a lot to undo the damage that's been done.
So what do you say to people who are looking to contribute to that effort? Like you have a sort of unique position as someone who has a voice. You're a writer and you are kind of well known and you're able to write these articles and books, which is great. But what about the average person who's just horrified by this and wants to do something, but doesn't necessarily have the time or the skills to do the same sorts of things?
Sure. Well, I think that the first step, and actually not even just the first, I think the most important thing that anyone can do, and anyone can do this, no matter who you are, where you are, is to write a prisoner in solitary confinement or a prisoner in general. Our prison, the reason that, you ask how did it get to this point? The reason it was able to get to this point is because our prisons are completely opaque. No one knows what's going on inside of them. It's so hard to even get in. And when you do get in, it's completely controlled by the administration. And the prisoner is in many ways gagged. Letters are ways of slowly chipping away at this fortress, and forcing our prisons to become more transparent. In England, in the 90s, they started to use solitary confinement on a larger scale for the first time. In England, their prisons, even though the population is rising really fast and they have a gang problem very similar to the U.S. and similar to California, they started to use solitary confinement as a control mechanism. And the outside bodies that monitor their prisons, which we don't have, came into the prisons, documented the whole thing, and quickly, within less than a year, they could see violence overall in prison was going up. That people were coming out worse than when they went in, more violent, more difficult to deal with. They stopped using the practice. In England now, they only have a few dozen people in solitary confinement, really what they say are the worst of the worst. So I'm not saying we can get rid of solitary confinement overnight, but if we did something as simple as forced every state right now to do an audit of who is in solitary confinement and to justify why they're there, and to account for it, I guarantee you we could probably reduce it in half from something as simple as an audit. Several states have done that. Vermont did an audit, and they let 80% of the people out of solitary confinement. People get lost in there. They get locked in there and forgotten about and unaccounted for, and there's just simply no one doing the due diligence to get them out.
Yeah, it's troubling, but I guess it is hopeful on one level that some states have started to do this, and pressure has started to come from different sides.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess so. You started this out by talking about how you reached out as kind of a personal way to connect. Do you feel that this process of getting more involved with solitary confinement has actually been able to help your recovery, or your reentry into normal American life?
Whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
Sure. Yes. I love my life. I love my work. It's very inspiring. I can't say it's easy. But I get so much inspiration from the people inside that I'm in communication with. I mean, I'm not trying to say they're perfect. I'm not putting them up on pedestals, but there's so many just incredibly brave human beings, and how hard they're willing to fight gives me so much energy. It makes my problems seem pretty small on a daily basis on the outside. And, one example that I like to bring up, since we're talking also about writing and correspondence and that way of despite this, horrifying isolation, people find a way to connect and to stay a part of the human family and to preserve their social selves and identities. And, when I was in prison, there was a woman named Zahra Bahrami who was picked up. She was a Green Movement protester. And she and I developed a way of communicating through clandestine letter correspondence. I would actually take a maxi pad and I would soak it in the stew that we would get, as a kind of beef stew, so that it would look like a soiled maxi pad. I stole a pen from my interrogators, got a little scrap of cardboard from the trash, and wrote her a note and tucked it inside this soiled-looking maxi pad, left it in the trash in the shared restroom that we both used at the end of the hallway. Zahra would come by my cell, and we had to be blindfolded when we were in the hallway, but you can sort of tilt your head back and look underneath the blindfold, and she would smile, and she would say, "I love you. I saw your mom on BBC. She gave me so much hope." And through these letter correspondence, we got to know each other quite well, and it was just an incredible experience for me to have this kind of support. And when I got out and started to look into prisons in the United States, I found every solitary unit that I investigated and visited or wrote someone in, they have a way of corresponding with each other. They find a way around the rules. There's this thing called kite flying where they make a string and tie a weight to the end, and they both sail these strings under their doors. There's a little gap under the cell door, which is necessary because otherwise prisoners will flood their cells with water. And so you fly it out into the hallway, the two weights connect, and then you yell, "Pull it in," and the receiving guy pulls in both lines, and at the end of the line is a note. And that's called kite flying or fishing. And it's one way that people reach out to each other. So when I was caught passing a note to Zahra Bahrami, I was punished by not being able to see Shane and Josh for 2 weeks. We would have these 30-minute visits together that they granted us after many, many months. 2 weeks was a horrible punishment for me. I found out that in Pelican Bay prison, through kite flying, this one prisoner passed a birthday card, a beautiful card that he hand drew, all around the pod. Everyone in the pod signed it, and then delivered it to the guy whose birthday it was, and all sang him happy birthday into the corridor. If they had been caught at Pelican Bay doing this, if this card had been confiscated by a guard, each one of them could have gotten 6 more years in the hole. And they all knew this. They were completely cognizant of this risk that they were taking, but that was worth it for them in order to show a simple gesture to another human being of being able to give them a birthday card. And that's the kind of thing that just blows my mind.
Yeah.
And just keeps me going.
No, that's incredible. And really kind of a little bit of a hopeful note to end on, I guess, the fact that people are able to, as you said, maintain their humanity and find these ways. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience.
You're so welcome.
And hopefully we'll be seeing your play in theaters near us.
Oh, I hope so.
Sometime
Yeah.
soon.
And people can stay in touch with me. My website is just my name, sarahshourd.com. And Solitary Watch has a wonderful, that's one way to stay in touch with this issue. And also ACLU has a really effective campaign, Stop Solitary. There's a lot of ways you can plug in. Sorry,
Shane, your husband also does work on, I know he's written on it as well, right? He's also a journalist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.